Sunday evenings in our family mansion always carried a ritualistic feel. The long mahogany dining table, polished so well you could see the chandelier's reflection in it, was set with crystal glasses and silverware that had belonged to my grandmother. The walls carried the smell of rosemary chicken and garlic bread. My mother always insisted on a full dinner spread when the family gathered. Yet no matter how lavish the meal, I knew what awaited me at that table wasn't comfort. It was judgment. I took my seat near the end, as always, listening to the clinking of cutlery and the steady hum of conversation. My siblings sat closer to my mother, their voices overlapping as they discussed quarterly numbers, new contracts, and the expansion of our family's business. I had earned an MBA, worked abroad, and had ideas I wanted to share. But ideas rarely mattered in this house if they came from me. My mother, Marceline, ruled the room. And her pride, her golden children, were the ones sitting near her elbows, laughing, nodding, talking about our empire. I kept quiet, cutting into my food, though the taste didn't register. I watched their faces, the way they smiled with approval when she praised them. I felt the sting of absence, of never being in that spotlight. They spoke about future projects, how my brother had just closed a deal in Dallas, how my sister secured a major investor in Miami. I was invisible. And yet, in the pit of my stomach, there was a certainty that this night would push me past a line I had silently towed for years. "Raise your glass," my mother announced, her diamond bracelet catching the light as she lifted her wine. "To Carter Group, and to the ones who carry it forward." Everyone clinked their glasses together, the air full of cheer. I tapped my water against my own fork, the sound swallowed in the noise. Then came the laughter, the sharp comparisons. My brother leaned across the table, smirking. "Lynn's the philosopher of the family, always dreaming, never delivering." My aunt chuckled. "Every family needs one like her. Keeps things interesting, right?" Their voices folded over each other, easy and dismissive. I forced a smile, though inside, every word landed heavy. Marceline turned her head slowly toward me. "You should be proud of your siblings, Lynn. They're out there building this business every single day. Meanwhile, she let the sentence hang in the air, long enough to make the silence heavier than her words. You spend too much time in ideas that go nowhere." I wanted to respond, but I swallowed the thought. Instead, I remembered something Eleanor Roosevelt once said. "No one can make you feel inferior without your consent." Yet here, sitting among people who shared my blood, I felt my own worth shrinking under their gaze. My silence wasn't weakness, it was armor. The meal continued, but the tone had shifted. Relatives leaned into the spectacle, tossing little jabs like darts. My cousin muttered, "Lynn's just the dreamer," and the table erupted in chuckles. Each laugh pushed me further into the quiet space I had carved for myself over years. Then it came, the moment that sealed the evening. My mother set her glass down firmly, the sound echoing. She looked at me without hesitation, her voice flat and absolute. "You add nothing to this business." The room froze. Forks paused mid-air. My father, who often played silent witness, nodded slowly in agreement. No one met my eyes. It was easier to look away. My brother smirked again. My sister's lips curved into a polite smile, as if they'd been waiting for that verdict to finally be spoken aloud. I felt the sting, but I didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. Instead, I scanned every detail, the way my mother's fingers tapped against her glass, the tilt of my father's head, the satisfaction etched on my siblings' faces. Inside, a thought pulsed. Silence isn't weakness, it's preparation. I chewed, swallowed, and pushed back my chair. "Excuse me," I said softly. The scrape of the chair against the floor sounded like thunder in that room of marble and chandeliers. No one stopped me. No one asked where I was going. I walked out slowly, deliberately, as though I was carrying something heavier than words. Upstairs, I closed my bedroom door and let the quiet settle around me. Alone, I replayed the evening in my mind, every laugh, every slight, every eye that refused to meet mine. My heart pounded, not with shame, but with a fierce, restrained fire. I sat at my desk, opened the drawer, and pulled out a keepsake I had kept hidden for years. My grandfather's old pocket watch. It ticked faintly, a reminder of the one man who had once told me, "You have more in you than they'll ever admit." I held the watch in my hand and let the memory steady me. Tonight wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. The cruelty at that table had planted something unshakable. "They thought I was invisible," I whispered into the empty room. That night, I promised myself I would make them see me. The morning light crept into my room long before I was ready to face another day in that house. I reached for my phone, its glow sharp against the quiet of my bedroom. My inbox had filled overnight, threads marked urgent and high priority. I scrolled until I found the schedule for the week, the calendar for the upcoming client meetings. My eyes moved across the list of names included in the thread. My brother, my sister, my mother, a handful of directors. Mine wasn't there. I scrolled again, certain I'd missed it. But no, it was absent. The omission wasn't an oversight. It was intentional. In this family, nothing happened by accident. I leaned back, letting the silence of the room settle around me. There's a saying in business I had once read in a leadership journal: "If you're not at the table, you're on the menu." That morning, the phrase rang louder than any alarm clock. My family had made sure I wasn't seated at the table. They had chosen me as the meal. I showered, dressed, and drove downtown, the skyline of Houston sharp against the pale sky. The Carter Group's headquarters gleamed with its glass exterior, but to me, it looked like a fortress where I was always expected to enter through the side door. Inside, the lobby buzzed with movement. Assistants rushed with folders clutched to their chests, their voices quick and clipped. They nodded politely at me, but none of them addressed me as a leader. I was background noise in the very building my family claimed was our legacy. When I stepped onto the executive floor, the energy shifted. My mother stood at the center, giving instructions with that sharp clarity that always made people snap to attention. My siblings hovered near her, each with their polished confidence, their voices carrying the authority she had bestowed upon them. "We'll need these reports polished for the Arab delegation by tomorrow," Marceline said, waving a hand as if her words alone rearranged the air. She didn't glance my way, "And make sure the slides emphasize the Dallas and Miami successes." "Yes, Mrs. Carter," an assistant replied, scribbling notes. I stood quietly at the periphery. I'd worked on cross-cultural strategy during my years abroad, earned degrees they bragged about when it suited them, but none of that mattered here. Here, I was a shadow. The polished floors reflected me back like a ghost trailing behind them. My brother caught sight of me and smirked, the same smirk I had memorized at too many dinner tables. "Mom, should we bring Lynn into the presentation?" His tone carried the flavor of sarcasm. Marceline didn't even turn her head. "She's here to observe, that's all." Her words hung in the air, slicing through me more cleanly than if she had shouted. Meetings came and went. Papers shuffled, numbers were debated, but no one asked for my input. Not a glance, not a word. I sat at the edge of the room, cataloging every gesture, every slight. Late morning, Marceline turned sharply toward me. "Lynn, make sure the coffee service is set up before the client arrives. And have copies of the contract printed, clean, double-sided." I blinked. Coffee, copies. I had studied international law, navigated cross-border negotiations in Europe, but here I was reduced to serving drinks. I felt my chest tighten, but I forced myself to breathe evenly. "Of course," I said calmly. My voice betrayed none of the fire in my chest. My sister leaned close to her assistant, whispering just loud enough for me to catch. "An MBA reduced to office errands. Talk about wasted tuition." They both laughed softly. I straightened my shoulders. Inside, my thoughts pressed hard against the walls of my composure. In America, women were told to lean in, but no one warned us that leaning in could sometimes mean being shoved down harder, the weight of patriarchy and nepotism pressing until you were beneath the table you'd tried to join. So I played the part they handed me. I walked to the break room, arranged the coffee service with steady hands, lined up cups with precision. My reflection stared back at me in the polished silver of the carafe. I wasn't a maid, I wasn't an intern, but they wanted me to believe I was. As I prepared the trays, I caught the eyes of an older assistant who had been with the company for decades. Her face softened, just briefly, and she offered a small nod, sympathy that needed no words. She saw me, and that acknowledgement, though quiet, reminded me I wasn't entirely invisible. Carrying the tray back, I listened to the laughter spilling from the boardroom. Their voices rose and fell, confident, arrogant, rehearsed. I placed the cups gently, one by one, the smell of coffee filling the room like a bitter perfume. They didn't thank me. They never did. I returned to my desk near the corner, where the shadows seemed more honest than the faces at the table. I let my thoughts sharpen. And they thought they were keeping me small, boxing me into the margins of their story. But walls built too high collapse eventually, and I had begun quietly stacking the bricks of my own evidence. That morning, my name was missing from an email. By evening, I knew my chance would come. By the time I drove home that evening, the city lights of Houston had already begun to glow, casting reflections on the windshield, like fragments of thoughts I couldn't quite piece together. The humiliation of the day still clung to me, the missing name in the email, the coffee tray in my hands, the smirk on my sister's face. My body moved on autopilot as I walked through the front door, exchanged a few polite words with the house staff, and retreated upstairs to the sanctuary of my room. I sat at my desk and let the silence stretch. The laughter from the boardroom still rang in my ears. Every chuckle, every sideways glance, they had become a chorus I knew too well. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling, when an old thought tugged at me. My grandfather. The only one who ever told me I had more to offer than anyone cared to admit. I pulled open the bottom drawer of my desk, the one I hadn't touched in years. Buried beneath files and faded receipts lay a leather-bound notebook, its cover worn smooth by time. The edges were frayed, the pages yellowed, but the moment I held it in my hands, I felt something shift. I flipped through carefully, the smell of old paper rising up, comforting and grounding. His handwriting filled every line, notes on business ethics, fragments of speeches, reminders of what mattered in a world obsessed with profit. And then my eyes landed on a page I'd never forgotten. "One day," he had written, "you will be the keeper of the key." The words stopped me cold. He had believed in me when no one else did. My mother dismissed me, my father ignored me, my siblings laughed. But he had seen something different. This notebook, in my hands, was more than just ink and paper. It was a promise. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Grandpa, I hear you." The memory it stirred was sharp, cutting through years of silence. I was 23 the first time I tried to speak up in a family business meeting. We were seated in the same boardroom where I'd been humiliated so often since. My mother presided over the table, her voice commanding. My siblings took turns presenting reports. When a pause opened, I cleared my throat and spoke. "What if we expand into the Houston suburbs?" I had said. "There's growth potential there, especially with new developments. We could build a stronger base closer to home before spreading too thin." The room fell silent for a second, and for a moment, I thought they might actually consider it. But then my mother's voice cut through like a blade. "Sit down, Lynn," she said sharply. "This isn't child's play." Laughter followed, quick, dismissive, crushing. My brother leaned back in his chair, smirking. My sister whispered to her assistant, shaking her head. Even my father remained quiet, complicit in his silence. I felt my face burn, but I forced myself into stillness, letting the humiliation soak into my bones. That day I learned silence was safer. To speak was to invite ridicule. But tonight, holding the notebook, I saw it differently. That moment hadn't been my failure. It had been theirs. I ran my fingers across the faded ink. My family measured worth in chairs at the table, in titles printed on business cards, in proximity to power. But my grandfather measured it in courage, in integrity, in the strength to stand when no one else believed you could. "Never let anyone write you out of your own story," he used to tell me when we walked the property together. "Their pen isn't stronger than your will." The sting from dinner, the exclusion from emails, the petty errands, they collided now with his words, fusing into something sharper. The pain was no longer just pain. It was fuel. I sat straighter, the notebook open before me. Page after page reminded me of lessons long buried, that respect wasn't inherited, it was earned, that the truth had power even when people tried to bury it, that silence could be a weapon, not just a wound. I thought back to the smirk on my brother's face that morning, to the way my sister whispered as if I wasn't in the room, to the casual cruelty of my mother's dismissal. They wanted me erased, but every attempt at erasure was becoming evidence. Every slight was a stone they laid in the foundation of the rebellion they couldn't see forming. I pressed my palm firmly on the notebook's cover, as though I could absorb its strength into my skin. I had promised myself once that I wouldn't let their cruelty define me. Tonight, I made a new promise, to live up to the faith my grandfather had placed in me. "They silenced me once," I whispered to the empty room. "They won't silence me again." By mid-morning, the boardroom at Carter Group was already buzzing. The long mahogany table stretched almost the length of the room, polished so carefully that the ceiling lights gleamed across its surface. Each seat had a nameplate, neatly arranged, waiting for its occupant. As I walked in, I scanned the table quickly, searching for mine. It wasn't there. Even the interns had their places, their names spelled out in block letters on shiny brass cards. My siblings' nameplates gleamed near my mother's, their positions secure, their voices already raised in easy conversation. I stood there, taking in the absence. No mistake, no oversight, just absence. I lingered near the doorway for a moment longer than I should have, then chose to stand quietly along the wall. I folded my arms, not in defiance, but to steady myself. In America, I had once heard a CEO say, "The seat you're given at the table tells you everything about your worth." That truth had never felt sharper. Marceline entered minutes later, flanked by her assistant. Her presence drew the room into order. Voices dropped, papers shuffled, eyes fixed on her. She glanced around, and when her gaze reached me, she lifted one hand casually toward the corner. "If you insist on staying, Lynn," she said, her tone crisp, "you can sit over there." The chair she indicated wasn't at the table. It sat pressed against the wall, near the catering cart, clearly meant for support staff. My chest tightened, but I moved toward it without a word. The scrape of its legs against the floor was louder than any protest I could have voiced. My siblings avoided my eyes. One smirked faintly, enjoying the spectacle. I lowered myself onto the chair, feeling the humiliation press in. Respect isn't taken away with a scream, it's erased with a gesture, and my mother was an expert at erasure. The meeting rolled on. Numbers, forecasts, new opportunities, all spoken in confident tones. I listened, cataloging each detail. I had spent years absorbing everything they dismissed me from, and in silence, I had become sharper than they ever intended. Halfway through, my uncle leaned back in his chair, his voice breaking through the monotony. "This company will never be in your hands, Lynn. Better focus on marriage, not meetings." The boardroom erupted in awkward laughter. My brother added quickly, "He's only half joking." I sat still, my hands pressed against my lap. My fists wanted to clench, but I forced them to remain open. Inside, anger swelled, sharp and familiar. In their eyes, I was never a partner, only an obligation. Marceline didn't defend me, she didn't need to. The silence she maintained was worse than words, it was permission. Permission for them to dismiss me, to laugh, to fold me into the role they had assigned long ago. I glanced around the table. Every smile, every chuckle, every glance that slid past me rather than toward me, I recorded them like evidence. Each moment was a stone laid on a foundation I was building quietly in my mind. When the meeting finally wound down, I remained seated. Not out of deference, but out of calculation. I wanted them to see me sitting where they placed me, silent, still, seemingly compliant. But inside, the promise I had made to myself the night before burned brighter. I looked again at the empty chair by the catering cart, now a symbol etched into my mind. They wanted me erased from their table, stripped from their legacy. But symbols can shift. One day, I told myself, I'll take more than a chair. I'll take the whole table. That day, I left the boardroom not defeated, but burning. The morning air inside Carter Group's lobby was charged with formality. I walked through the glass doors into a scene staged like a performance. Suits crisp, smiles fixed, the staff lined up as though royalty was arriving. And in a sense, they were. Our Arab clients, dignified and observant, their every movement deliberate. I stood off to the side, taking it in. They moved with quiet assurance, shaking hands firmly, acknowledging everyone they passed. Even the assistants carrying folders received respectful nods. Respect is a universal language, I thought. And so is disrespect. Marceline approached, heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. She leaned close to me, her perfume heavy, her voice controlled. "Stay near, but don't involve yourself. You're here for appearance, nothing more." I nodded once, though my mind bristled. I bowed politely when the delegation reached us, my hands folded carefully. Their eyes softened in acknowledgement. But before the moment could deepen, Marceline stepped forward, placing her arm lightly around my sister's shoulders. "Gentlemen, this is Eliza, our rising star. And here is Daniel, already proving himself indispensable." They exchanged pleasantries, voices formal yet warm. Then, as though remembering, Marceline gestured at me with a dismissive flick. "And this is my youngest daughter, Lynn. She's just here for the ride." The words landed with the weight of a gavel. The clients looked momentarily puzzled, glancing at me and back at her. I forced a calm smile, though fire spread in my chest. To them, I had been positioned as a placeholder, decoration without purpose. Daniel chuckled lightly, filling the silence. "She keeps us company. Every team needs morale, right?" He grinned, waiting for laughter. None came. The delegation remained polite, their silence louder than his attempt at humor. I inhaled slowly, reminding myself of a truth Maya Angelou once wrote. "People will forget what you said, they'll forget what you did, but they'll never forget how you made them feel." Today, I felt the sting of being reduced to nothing before strangers, and I knew they would remember the awkwardness Marceline had created. The introductions concluded, and the group began to move toward the boardroom. My siblings walked ahead, their confidence radiating. I followed, steps steady, determined not to shrink even as the humiliation clung like smoke. At the doors, I fell into line behind them. But Marceline pivoted abruptly, her eyes sharp. "Not today, Lynn. This is serious business." Her tone carried no softness. She didn't whisper. She wanted the clients to hear. One of the delegates paused, glancing between us, but she pressed forward, her assistant stepping smoothly to my side. "Escort Miss Harper to the lounge." The assistant's touch on my arm was light but firm. I let him guide me away, my head high. Every step back down that hall was measured. They thought they were burying me in silence, pushing me out of sight. But silence was not a grave for me. It was a forge. The boardroom doors shut behind them with a muted thud. I stood outside, staring at the frosted glass, my own reflection looking back at me. On the surface, calm. Beneath, fire. I walked to a chair along the corridor wall, lowered myself with deliberate ease, and folded my hands. I sat still, but inside, I repeated a vow that steadied me. One day, these same doors that shut me out will be the doors I walk through leading the way. That afternoon, I was erased from the room. By nightfall, the cracks in their control began to show. The next morning, the executive boardroom of Carter Group was prepared like a battlefield. The long table gleamed under the light, polished until every reflection showed nerves and pride alike. The delegation from the Middle East entered with quiet dignity, their movements deliberate, their robes and suits marking authority that needed no announcement. Everyone in the room straightened as they took their seats, and I followed behind, instructed again to remain near the wall. Marceline stood tall, her confidence wrapping around her like armor. Daniel and Eliza shuffled papers, whispering to each other as though they had rehearsed a victory speech. I settled into a chair pushed back from the table, notebook on my lap, silent but attentive. Odette Barnes, the lead delegate, began outlining the terms with precision. Her voice was even, her posture deliberate, her eyes sharp as she moved between languages smoothly. I listened carefully, noting how each point was delivered with patience, an emphasis on respect and mutual gain. My family, however, heard only opportunity. Marceline interrupted often, pushing her voice over Odette's explanations. "This partnership," she declared, "will mark the greatest expansion in Carter Group's history. We are uniquely positioned to lead." I thought back to something I once wrote in the margins of my grandfather's notebook. "Deals are won in listening, not boasting." Yet here I was, watching my family make the same mistake I had feared they would, mistaking arrogance for strength. The room was full of expectation, but I could feel tension growing beneath the polite words. Every boast, every interruption, was stacking like weights on a fragile structure. I sat silently, cataloging, waiting. Marceline leaned forward, her eyes alight. "Gentlemen, this is our biggest opportunity yet." The Carter name stands for excellence, and this agreement will prove it. Odette's expression remained unreadable, but her colleagues shifted slightly, exchanging subtle glances. They emphasized precision, clarity, cultural respect. One spoke firmly. "Respect for our traditions is not optional. It is essential." I could almost hear my grandfather's voice in my memory. "Respect isn't given in words, it's proven in details." Daniel nodded quickly, his confidence almost careless. "Of course," he said. "But you'll find we've prepared everything. We know what's best for this market." I felt my chest tighten. They were dismissing the very nuances that could make or break this deal. Hospitality, patience, honor. These were not extras. They were the foundation. My siblings believed power alone could close the deal. They were wrong. Then came the moment that shifted everything. Eliza rose, flipping through her notes, and attempted a phrase in Arabic. Her voice stumbled, the pronunciation off, the word warped into something unintended. The delegation stiffened immediately, their expressions controlled but sharp, and Marceline, without missing a beat, added words that twisted the knife further. "As for intellectual property," she said, her tone breezy, "our firm will hold complete control of any inventions developed through this partnership. Naturally, our clients understand the need for this protection." The silence that followed was louder than her words. I watched Odette's eyes narrow, the polite mask thinning. Another delegate muttered something to his colleague in Arabic, the tone sharp, unmistakably displeased. The air shifted, heavy, almost suffocating. I gripped my notebook, heart pounding, not from fear, but from clarity. The deal was slipping. All their arrogance, all their noise, it was unraveling. For years they had silenced me. Now their own words were silencing them. Marceline cleared her throat, attempting to recover. "We're, of course, open to discussion." But the delegation's chairs shifted. Papers were placed down. The body language was unmistakable. Withdrawal. I glanced at my siblings, their confidence cracked, panic leaking through their polished facades. Eliza's cheeks flushed. Daniel bit his lip. Marceline's hand tapped against the table in a rhythm of frustration. This was the face of power losing its grip, something I had never seen before. I leaned slightly forward, my voice silent but my mind sharp as glass. This is the crack I've been waiting for. The deal was collapsing, and with it, their control. My turn was coming. The deal was teetering on the edge of collapse. I could feel it in the weight of the silence after Marceline's misstep, in the rigid posture of the delegates as they pushed their chairs back slightly, in the way Odette's fingers tapped the table with sharp precision. For a moment, I thought they would stand and walk away, ending everything in one decisive gesture. My siblings fumbled with their notes, their faces pale. Marceline opened her mouth, but the words she tried to force out carried no authority anymore. My heart pounded, not from fear, but from something older, something that had been building with every insult, every slight. Silence is power, I had told myself for years, but even silence has an end. I stood before I could talk myself out of it. The scrape of my chair startled the room. Every head turned toward me. My mother's eyes flared, commanding me to sit, but I didn't. I looked directly at the clients and spoke, not in English, but in fluent Arabic. "Gentlemen, if I may, I believe there is a misunderstanding." The air froze. The delegates exchanged surprised glances, their eyes widening as they registered my words. My siblings blinked, caught between disbelief and panic. Marceline's lips pressed into a thin line. For the first time, I thought, my voice doesn't shake. It roars. One of the clients leaned forward slightly, intrigued. His tone softened as he replied in Arabic, testing me. I responded with ease, translating his concern with precision. The words flowed naturally, shaped by years of study and the echoes of my grandfather's lessons. I am Lynn Harper, I continued in Arabic, and though I have been asked to remain silent, I cannot let this partnership collapse because of a clause that was poorly presented. The tension shifted. The rigid stares of the clients softened into cautious curiosity. Their anger hadn't vanished, but it paused, suspended, as they listened. I explained carefully, addressing the clause about intellectual property. I reframed it respectfully, making clear that what had been said was not a reflection of intent, but a failure in communication. The delegates nodded slowly, murmuring to each other. One finally said in Arabic, "She understands." I translated aloud, letting the room hear it. The boardroom's air changed, like a storm pulling back just enough to let the sun break through. Hope flickered in the silence. But then Marceline's voice sliced through, sharp and cold. "Don't be fooled," she snapped. "She picked up a few phrases online. This isn't real business." Laughter, quick and cruel, came from my brother. "Yeah," he added. "She's just our little mascot. Pretty words. Nothing more." The sting was sharp, but I stood taller. Every insult was gasoline, and I was already on fire. The clients shifted uneasily, glancing at one another. Their expressions made it clear. They weren't unsettled by me, but by my family's eagerness to humiliate their own in public. Inside, my resolve hardened. Sometimes enemies don't sit across the table, they sit right beside you. I didn't argue with them. I didn't need to. My composure, my fluency, my willingness to stand when the deal was dying, all of it spoke louder than their mockery. I looked at Odette Barnes. She remained silent, but her eyes were locked on me, assessing, measuring. I sensed something shift in her. Recognition, perhaps respect. My family might have tried to bury me again, but this time, I refused to disappear. I sat down slowly, still holding the floor with nothing more than my calm posture. The next move, I thought, wouldn't come from me. It would come from them. And it would be war. I had suspected it since the whispers I overheard outside the lounge. The words had floated through the cracked door. Daniel's smug voice, Eliza's nervous laugh, Marceline's sharp command. Tighten the control clauses. We can't let them dictate terms. At the time, I tucked it away like another piece of evidence in a growing case. But as I sat in the boardroom now, the delegates across from us leafing through the thick bilingual contracts, I braced myself. Marceline's smile was practiced, her tone honeyed as she guided the clients through the English version. You'll see every term reflects our commitment to fairness and growth. We pride ourselves on transparency. My eyes drifted to the Arabic text. I had read enough drafts to sense when something felt off. The alignment was different, the phrasing too forceful, small changes, barely noticeable unless you were searching for them. But I was searching. I remembered my grandfather's words scribbled in the margin of his notebook. Trust can be destroyed by a single line. I leaned slightly forward, tracing the page with my eyes. My suspicion deepened. Odette Barnes sat with her usual composed stillness, but her colleagues were already whispering in low Arabic tones, their brows tightening. My heartbeat matched the rhythm of their unease. When I reached the section on intellectual property, my chest tightened. There it was. The Arabic text claimed Carter Group would retain complete ownership of any patents developed on foreign soil. It contradicted the English version, contradicted everything Marceline had just promised aloud. It wasn't sloppiness. It wasn't translation error. It was deliberate. My throat went dry, but my thoughts crystallized with clarity. They weren't careless. This was intentional. One delegate muttered sharply in Arabic, his voice edged with distrust. Another leaned toward Odette, pointing at the clause. Odette's jaw flexed. her expression darkening as she read silently. I heard my grandfather's voice again. Integrity is not negotiable. I knew I had a choice. I could stay silent and watch the deal die under the weight of deception, or I could do the one thing my family feared most, speak. I inhaled, rose slightly in my chair, and spoke firmly in Arabic. With respect, this clause is not what we agreed upon. The room shifted instantly. The clients froze, their eyes snapping toward me, then to Marceline. My siblings stiffened. The air seemed to thrum with shock. I continued, steady and unshaken. The English version makes no such claim. It acknowledges shared rights, consistent with what was discussed verbally, but this Arabic draft, this line, grants unilateral control to Carter Group. That is not the agreement you came here to sign. Murmurs rose among the delegates. Relief flickered across one man's face, as though my words had confirmed his suspicion. Marceline's chair scraped as she half stood, her voice biting. "Lynn, this isn't your place." But I didn't stop. I looked directly at Odette, then back to the group. "You deserve clarity. If we expect trust, it must be mutual. A deal built on hidden traps is no deal at all." My Arabic was clean, my tone respectful yet resolute. I saw the change in the delegates, the way their posture eased, the way their eyes warmed with recognition. One nodded, speaking softly. "She speaks truth." I translated for the rest of the room, my voice calm. "They say they value honesty, and they recognize fairness in what I presented." The relief was almost palpable. For a moment, the storm broke. Marceline glared daggers across the table, her lips pressed so tight they looked bloodless. My siblings bent their heads together, whispering furiously, scrambling to regain footing. But the momentum had shifted. Odette leaned forward, hands clasped, her gaze fixed on me. There was no dismissiveness in her eyes now, no polite tolerance. She studied me as though reassessing everything she had assumed. Inside, I felt something settle, an inner calm I hadn't known in years. Truth has a way of cutting through every lie, no matter who wields it. For the first time, they weren't looking at my mother. They were looking at me. "You've embarrassed us!" Marceline's voice cracked through the air the second the delegates leaned back in their chairs. She wasn't looking at the clients, she was looking at me. Daniel pointed his finger in my direction. "You undermined the whole family in front of them. Do you know what that looks like?" Eliza added, "You've made us a spectacle. Do you think they'll ever take us seriously again after you hijacked the meeting?" I stayed seated, hands calmly folded on the table. My voice didn't rise, my breathing stayed even. I watched the clients instead, saw how their eyes didn't narrow at me, but at the rage my family spewed openly. I thought, when people shout, they don't reveal strength, they reveal fear. Odette said nothing, she simply observed. That silence felt like an anchor for me, something steady while the storm of accusations crashed around me. I met my mother's glare and spoke evenly. "If the truth embarrassed you, maybe it wasn't me who caused it. Maybe it was the trap you set." A ripple of murmurs went through the room. Marceline's lips tightened, and Daniel slammed his notebook shut. But I refused to match their fury. I wouldn't give them that. The tension deepened until Odette finally leaned forward. She switched into Arabic, her tone precise. "Tell me, Lynn," she asked, "what is the meaning of hospitality in our culture, and why is it sacred?" The room stilled. My siblings leaned back, smug expressions spreading across their faces. They expected me to falter, to stumble in front of the very people I had just defended. I smiled slightly. I answered in Arabic, weaving not just words but layers of context, how hospitality was a covenant, how the guest was honored above all, how contracts themselves were extensions of mutual respect. Odette's lips curved into the faintest smile. One of her colleagues nodded approvingly. "She understands not just the words," he said in Arabic, "but the meaning." I translated calmly into English for the rest of the table. "They say they value the explanation and recognize my understanding." The smirks slipped from my siblings' faces. Odette then turned deliberately away from Marceline and spoke directly to the group. "This deal continues only if she," her eyes flicked to me, "is part of it." The words fell like thunder. Marceline froze, her eyes widening in disbelief. Daniel coughed into his fist. Eliza sat rigid, pale as paper. The boardroom's silence was so sharp it felt like it could slice skin. I narrated inwardly, my chest tight but steady. Years of dismissal, crumbling in seconds. I wasn't naive. Recognition didn't feel like victory alone. It felt like weight, a mantle pressed onto my shoulders. They hadn't given me this respect. I had carved it out of stone, one humiliation at a time, until it stood undeniable. Daniel finally broke the silence. This is absurd. We are the executives, not her. Odette's eyes cooled as she looked at him. Respect isn't inherited, she said, her English crisp. It is earned. She earned it today. Marceline sank back into her chair, pride wounded so deeply she couldn't find words. My siblings exchanged glances, panic and resentment twisting their faces. The clients leaned toward me now, asking direct questions. They no longer addressed my family. They were speaking to me, not about me. I felt the shift entirely. The air that had once pressed me into silence now buoyed me forward. For the first time, I thought, they weren't talking about me. They were talking to me. But inside, a whisper cut through the calm. Recognition is never free. It always comes at a price, and I knew the price of their fury was coming. The silence in the boardroom was heavy, but it didn't last long. Marceline reached into her folder and slid a fresh document across the table. The movement was deliberate, her manicured fingers pressing the paper forward as if she were laying down a winning card. I knew that gesture. It was her last weapon. I glanced at the paper, the Arabic and English text aligned side by side. The clients leaned in cautiously, their brows tightening, their eyes flicked between me and my mother, uncertainty clouding the air. They didn't know who to believe anymore. Inside, I felt the weight of their fury aimed squarely at me. Betrayal rarely comes from strangers. It comes from the ones sitting closest to you, the ones who know how to cut deepest. Marceline wasn't trying to save the deal. She was trying to erase me one final time. The edges of my notebook dug into my palms as I steadied myself. This was their fury crystallized into paper, but I was ready. I opened my folder slowly, deliberately. From inside, I pulled out the draft I had prepared days ago, the one I hadn't shown anyone. I placed it directly beside Marceline's version. The room grew tense as two sets of contracts sat side by side, the truth waiting to be revealed. Let's review, I said evenly, my eyes on the delegates. I began highlighting the discrepancies, line by line. The English version promised partnership. The Arabic version Marceline submitted promised dominance. Where mine reflected respect, hers declared control. Odette leaned forward, her gaze intent, her pen hovering above the page. Explain this section, she said, tapping the disputed clause. I nodded, translating carefully, exposing how Marceline's draft claimed ownership of patents that should have remained shared. My voice didn't waver. This is not what we agreed to. This clause was inserted to shift power unfairly. The delegates whispered among themselves, their tone sharper now but directed at Marceline. Relief flickered in their eyes as they turned back toward me. One finally said aloud, "This version," pointing to mine, "matches our understanding." Marceline's face flushed with rage. "You think you can outmaneuver me?" she hissed under her breath. I didn't look at her. I kept my focus on the clients. Integrity cannot be negotiated. A deal without it is no deal at all. The nods came, one after another. The tide had shifted completely. Then I looked straight into my mother's eyes. The words came out steady, cold, final. This 2.3B deal exists because of me. The one you said added nothing. The silence was deafening. My words echoed, pressing into the corners of the room where even shadows seemed to retreat. My siblings shifted uncomfortably. Daniel tugged at his collar. Eliza stared at the floor. For once, their smirks had vanished. Inside, a flood of release surged. Years of humiliation, of carrying trays, of empty chairs and cutting remarks. It all collapsed into that single truth. Sometimes justice doesn't shout. Sometimes it whispers, and everyone still hears it. The clients exchanged approving glances. Respect filled the air where dismissal had once suffocated me. Finally, Odette stood. Her colleagues rose with her. They extended their hands across the table, but not to Marceline, not to my siblings. They reached for me. I rose slowly, every movement deliberate. I clasped each hand offered to me, their warmth steady, their respect undeniable. Marceline tried to recover, her lips parting as if to speak, but no invitation came her way. She stood outside of her own empire, unacknowledged. The weight of poetic justice landed. The one erased had become the only one recognized. As I shook the final hand, I thought quietly, respect isn't gifted, it's taken back. I had won, but victory always carries a cost. The boardroom was still thick with the echo of what had just happened. The delegates had shaken my hand, their words of confirmation still hanging in the air, while my mother sat pale, her lips pressed so tightly together they seemed carved in stone. My siblings slumped in their seats, silent, their bravado drained. The weight of victory settled on me, but it wasn't light or joyful. Success doesn't always feel like fireworks. It sometimes feels like ashes settling after a fire. The smoke clears, and you see what's been destroyed, what cannot be rebuilt. I looked across the table at the people who had called me useless, who had laughed when I tried to speak, who had reduced me to errands and empty chairs. Now they had nothing to say. For the first time, they couldn't dismiss me. For the first time, their silence admitted what they would never confess in words. I breathed slowly, my hands resting on the table. This was the reckoning I had known was coming. Marceline finally broke the silence. Her voice had lost its sharpness. It trembled, stripped of command. "If it weren't for you," she said slowly, "we would have lost everything." The words fell with a thud, heavy but hollow. They weren't warm, they weren't loving. It wasn't an apology, it was survival. Recognition without affection, acknowledgement without love. My siblings stared at the polished surface of the table, unable to meet my eyes. Daniel's jaw was tight. Eliza's hands clasped so firmly in her lap, I could see the whiteness of her knuckles. I thought quietly, it wasn't an apology. It was survival. And survival is all they ever taught me. The hollow triumph settled deeper inside me. For years, I had craved a moment when my parents would finally say I mattered, and here it was, reduced to a single reluctant line, offered not from the heart, but from fear. I realized in that moment I didn't need their validation anymore. American culture had taught me something my family never could: independence, dignity, self-worth. You may not control all the events that happen to you, but you can decide not to be reduced by them. Maya Angelou's words rang true in my ears now. I didn't want reconciliation with people who only acknowledged me when they had no choice. I didn't want to win them back. Sometimes the bravest choice isn't to keep sitting at the table where you're disrespected, it's to stand up and walk away whole. I turned toward the delegates, answering their questions directly, firm but courteous. The conversation moved on, and the Carter family, my family, shrank into the background of their own company. When the meeting ended, I stood. My steps were steady, not hurried. The weight of my decision pressed clear in every movement. Odette and her colleagues followed me, their presence a silent declaration that they had chosen to align with me, not with the legacy of those who had once controlled the room. Behind me, Marceline remained seated. Her posture had collapsed, her back curved, her hands resting weakly on the table. For the first time, she looked smaller than the chair she sat in. I paused at the doorway, looking back once, not out of nostalgia, not to savor triumph, but to mark the end. I hadn't just closed a deal. I had closed the door on who they said I was. And as I stepped forward, the thought came steady and strong. Every ending is also a beginning. The boardroom was hushed in the aftermath of the storm. Papers lay scattered, water glasses half empty, the weight of what had unfolded still clinging to the air like smoke after a fire. Marceline sat stiffly in her chair, but the authority that had once radiated from her seemed drained away. Her voice, when she tried to gather it, cracked at the edges. "We can salvage this," she murmured, but no one leaned in to listen. Her words drifted and vanished before they reached the delegates. I studied her, the woman who had built walls around me my whole life. Now, in the silence, she looked smaller, diminished. I thought, power doesn't fade with noise. It fades with silence, when no one listens anymore. Daniel shuffled nervously with his papers, offering excuses that went unheard. Eliza opened her mouth twice, trying to regain footing, but every glance from the clients cut her off before a single full sentence left her lips. The shift was undeniable. This empire, their empire, no longer belonged to them. Odette cleared her throat, elegant and measured. The partnership has potential, she said in English, her gaze landing firmly on me. But only if it is handled with integrity from this point forward. Before Marceline could answer, I leaned forward. My voice was steady, carrying none of the tremors it once held when I dared to speak in this room. Then let me be clear. This partnership continues under one condition, under my leadership. The words stunned the room. Marceline gasped audibly, her hand gripping the edge of the table. "You can't be serious," she said, the last remnants of her command faltering. Daniel spat. "You've humiliated us enough." Eliza shook her head, eyes wide with panic. But I didn't flinch. Odette's lips curved faintly, a smile that was both acknowledgement and approval. She inclined her head ever so slightly, signaling her agreement. "I won't allow toxic influence to poison the future," I continued. "Not for the clients, not for myself. If this partnership is to mean anything, it must be built clean, not on deception or sabotage." I remembered a quote I had carried for years, one that felt truer in this moment than ever. Step out of the history that is holding you back. Step into the new story you are willing to create. Oprah's words rang inside me as I met every eye around that table. The clients conferred quietly among themselves before nodding. "Then it is settled," Odette said. "You will serve as liaison and lead." Marceline slumped in her chair, the fight leaving her eyes. My siblings sat rigid, their faces carved in disbelief. I stood, the movement deliberate, and looked at them one last time. My voice lowered, cold but resolute. "You said I added nothing. Today, I built everything you couldn't." The sentence hung in the boardroom like a final verdict. The silence that followed was stunned, absolute. The clients began to clap politely, a gesture of closure, while Daniel and Eliza gathered their things in shame, their eyes avoiding mine. Marceline lowered her gaze, no words left in her arsenal. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it stands and walks out the front door with its head held high. I walked through the glass doors of Carter Group headquarters as though I were shedding armor. Each step felt lighter, the toxic weight peeling off with the echo of my heels on the marble floor. Behind me, Odette and her team followed, their presence sealing the future in my name. Outside, the sun was bright, and the city stretched before me, vast and full of promise. I inhaled deeply, letting the air fill my chest like it hadn't in years. Choosing self-worth over toxic loyalty isn't betrayal, it's survival. I turned back once, only briefly, at the building that had once been a prison of expectations. Then I faced forward again. I wasn't just closing a 2.3B deal, I whispered to myself. I was opening the first chapter of my own empire. And for the first time, the name on the contract was mine, and mine alone.